Let me be very clear about something. If this were just about old UFO files, they would not be releasing them now. Honestly, the timing is the message. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that the mainstream conversation is completely missing. This is not a documentary event. It is a political signal. The Pentagon does not accidentally pick moments of maximum visibility when it could choose silence. It picks the moment when the public is distracted, when elite attention is split up, when the news cycle is hungry for something strange enough to soak up the spillover from everything else. That is not transparency in the innocent sense. That is controlled exposure. It is the use of disclosure as an instrument, not as an act of surrender. The obvious mistake is to ask whether the files prove something extraordinary. That is the wrong first question. The right question is why the institution found it useful to release them now. After years of quiet containment, in a period when public trust is already thin, and every major authority is competing for narrative space, when the public is exhausted, it becomes easier to manage them with spectacle. When the media is overloaded, it becomes easier to bury the strategic meaning inside a sensational headline. That is the arithmetic of attention. That is what they are counting on. The Pentagon understands this better than anyone. It has spent decades learning how to release information without giving up control of the frame. It does not just declassify. It stages the conditions under which declassification can be interpreted in the direction it prefers. A file dump is not neutral if the release date is chosen to line up with other pressures. A disclosure is not automatically honest if the institution keeps custody of the context, the definitions, the metadata, and the official explanation. The archive may be opened, but the interpretation is still fenced in. That matters because timing tells you what kind of pressure exists. If the organization had no need to send a message, it could have waited. If it feared a loss of control, it would release selectively with enough ambiguity to prevent closure, but enough visibility to claim openness. That is the pattern. Release just enough to look forthcoming. Release it at a moment when the audience is too distracted to organize the implications. Release it when the institution benefits from being seen as transparent rather than from being truly transparent. This is why the timing itself is evidence of strategy. The release is happening in a political environment where official institutions are under stress, public trust is unstable, and every major power is fighting over credibility. In that kind of environment, even an apparently odd disclosure can serve a larger function. It can reassert institutional relevance. It can signal that the gatekeepers still control the gate. It can remind adversaries, allies, and domestic audiences alike that the monopoly on interpretation has not disappeared. It has just adapted. Most people stop at the mystery. That is exactly where they are supposed to stop. But the real contest is not over whether something unusual exists in the sky. The real contest is over who gets to define what the public is allowed to think when unusual things are acknowledged. In that sense, disclosure is not the end of control. It is often the refinement of control, and that leads to the deeper geopolitical layer. The Pentagon does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in an era of collapsing trust, adversarial information warfare, and constant competition over narrative authority. A controlled release like this is useful because it tests the public reaction, measures the media response, and tells other states that the United States can still shape the terms of revelation on its own schedule. That is not just a domestic maneuver. It is a signal to rivals that the machinery of interpretation remains intact. So the real story is not what the files prove. The real story is why the release happened now, what pressure made controlled disclosure useful, and how a defense institution can turn transparency into leverage. Once you see the timing as strategy, the rest of the move becomes much easier to read. That leads to the next question. What kind of pressure makes a defense institution prefer controlled exposure over quiet containment? Once the timing is decoded, the mechanics of the decision begin to show. The release only matters because it happened at a moment when silence had become more costly than disclosure, and when the Pentagon could afford to define the frame before anyone else did. That is the first thing to understand. The timing was not neutral, and it was not accidental. What matters here is not simply that files were released, but that the institution chose the moment of release. That usually means pressure had piled up from multiple directions at once. On one side, congressional scrutiny had made continued concealment expensive. Committees do not need to know everything to create danger for a department. They only need enough leverage to force internal review, subpoenas, hearings, and paper trails that start to multiply. On another side, bureaucratic competition inside the national security system can make selective disclosure useful. One office leaks to protect itself from another. One chain of command releases a narrow slice of information to keep a broader inquiry from landing in a more damaging form. That is how institutions survive, not by telling the truth, but by choosing which version of the truth arrives first. Then there is the ecosystem outside the building. Whistleblowers, former staff, contractors, junior officers, and analysts all create pressure fields around the center. The Pentagon does not have to believe every claim in that environment to understand the danger. It only has to recognize that if it waits too long, somebody else will release a less controlled version of the same material. A file dump can be a defensive move. It can be a preemptive strike against a worse leak. In that sense, transparency becomes a tool of containment. The institution is not confessing. It is trying to occupy the terrain before its opponents do. The media layer matters too. Once a topic starts moving through major outlets, the bureaucracy knows the story will no longer belong to classification authorities alone. At that point, the choice is not between secrecy and openness. It is between controlled revelation and uncontrolled interpretation. So the release is shaped to produce maximum ambiguity. Enough detail to satisfy procedural demands. Enough opacity to preserve deniability. Enough spectacle to dominate the news cycle. Not enough substance to end the argument. That is not an accident. That is method. The real story is not whether the files prove something extraordinary. The real story is why disclosure became useful now. Why did the balance shift? Why was it better to let information out than to keep it sealed? Usually the answer is that the institution sensed it was losing control of the narrative. It may have been facing pressure from above, from below, and from outside all at once. Senior leadership may have needed a managed release to answer lawmakers. Mid-level managers may have needed to protect themselves from internal blame. Outside actors may have been closing in with leaks, litigation, or public campaigns that would force a far less elegant disclosure. That is how the Pentagon can turn transparency into control. It publishes first, and then it insists that publication itself proves responsibility. But what it really proves is that the institution saw the storm coming. It calculated that limited openness was safer than total resistance. It also understood a deeper geopolitical fact in a system where trust is scarce. Whoever speaks first often gets to define what counts as reality. The battle is not only over facts, it is over interpretation, sequencing, and authority. So when you look at the release, do not ask only what it says. Ask what pressure made it possible. Ask why this amount of information, in this form, at this moment. Ask who needed the release, who feared a larger one, and who benefits when the public mistakes a defensive maneuver for candor. But pressure alone does not explain the shape of the release. The more important clue is what was included, what was omitted, and how those choices turn into theater. What looks like openness can also be a pressure valve, a way to let out just enough truth to keep the system from cracking under its own secrecy. That is the first thing to understand here. A file release is not the same thing as disclosure, and disclosure is not the same thing as accountability. The structure of the file matters more than the headline attached to it. A document can look dramatic and still be strategically incomplete. A page can be real and still be unusable. That is how governments preserve leverage. They release material that appears to answer the question while carefully denying the public the ability to test the answer. Redactions do not just remove names or methods. They remove chain of custody, timing, corroboration, and the connective tissue that turns fragments into evidence. Once the context is stripped away, the document stops functioning as proof and starts functioning as theater. This is where most people get trapped. They treat the file as a verdict. It is not a verdict. It is an artifact. The difference is everything. Evidence has to survive interrogation. Interpretation only has to survive the first reading. A government that understands this can flood the zone with partial material and still control the outcome, because the release itself becomes the event. The public is no longer asking what happened. The public is asking what the file means, and that is a much safer question for power to manage. That is why archival framing is so important. What gets placed next to what gets dated before what gets summarized in the cover note, what gets withheld from the appendix, all of it shapes perception before a single analyst has finished reading. The file is not neutral storage. It is curated memory, and curated memory is a form of policy. It tells you not only what the institution is willing to admit, but what kind of admission it wants to become politically useful. The release happened now because timing is part of the message. When pressure rises from too many directions at once, controlled transparency becomes attractive. It can relieve public suspicion, preempt a worse leak, signal confidence to allies, and force adversaries into reacting to a narrative that the state itself designed. In that sense, transparency is not the opposite of control. It is one of control's more sophisticated instruments. The Pentagon does not have to tell the whole truth to shape the field. It only has to release enough to make every other version look speculative. And that is the deeper contest here, not whether the documents contain something extraordinary. The real issue is who gets to define what counts as extraordinary in the first place. If the institution releases a thin slice of the archive, it can present itself as open while retaining the monopoly on interpretation. It can make the public feel informed while keeping the decisive questions alive but unfocused. Why now? Why this material? Why this framing? Why this omission? Those are the questions that matter because they reveal the pressure on the system, not just the content of the file. Once ambiguity is understood as a tool, the next issue is not the files themselves, but the institution behind them. The Pentagon is not a neutral archive. It is a strategic actor with a memory and a doctrine. The point is not to end the mystery, but to manage it so that every answer creates two new layers of uncertainty. That is the logic of institutions that survive by controlling the frame, not by eliminating the problem. The Pentagon is not just a military headquarters. It is a bureaucratic empire with a deterrence mandate, a secrecy mandate, a signaling mandate, and a reputational mandate, all operating at the same time. That combination matters. It means the institution is never simply revealing information. It is always deciding how much truth to release, when to release it, and what political purpose that release will serve. If the Pentagon speaks first, it does not just describe reality. It authorizes reality. It decides which version becomes official, which version gets dismissed as speculation, and which version remains classified for the next cycle. That is why stage transparency is so useful. A controlled disclosure does not weaken the institution. It reinforces it. It tells the public that the system is open enough to be trusted, while preserving the right to hide what would actually damage the system if exposed. The release becomes proof of maturity. Look how serious we are. Look how accountable we are. Look how willing we are to confront the issue, and once that performance is accepted, the institution has already won the deeper contest because it has converted curiosity into compliance and skepticism into dependence on official interpretation. What is happening here is not merely disclosure. It is reputational management. The Pentagon absorbs criticism by releasing just enough material to make secrecy look measured rather than absolute. It signals confidence by appearing to admit ambiguity. It protects its monopoly by being the first and loudest voice in the room. The public is encouraged to believe that because the institution acknowledged the issue, the institution is now behaving transparently. In reality, the institution has just moved the boundary of the discussable. It has chosen which facts will be legible and which facts will remain outside the perimeter of acceptable knowledge. That is the deeper logic of state narrative control. The state does not need to suppress every competing account. It only needs to dominate the opening frame. Once the official version is established, every later correction has to fight uphill against language that already feels settled, normalized, and legitimate. This is how bureaucracies preserve authority in the age of skepticism. They do not pretend that secrecy is gone. They show that secrecy is managed. They do not promise full disclosure. They promise calibrated disclosure. That distinction is everything. The timing matters because disclosure is never neutral. If the release happens now, then something changed in the pressure environment. There is always a reason. Sometimes it is internal friction. Sometimes it is a legal or political risk. Sometimes it is the need to preempt a worse disclosure from somewhere else. Sometimes it is the requirement to shape allied perceptions before adversaries shape them first. But the common thread is the same. Transparency becomes useful when control is threatened by opacity. The institution opens a door, not because it has surrendered control, but because opening the door on its own terms is better than having it kicked open by someone else. That is why this kind of disclosure is so effective. It gives the appearance of candor while preserving the architecture of classification. It reassures allies, disciplines internal critics, and tells adversaries that the institution still sets the terms of revelation. In strategic terms, this is not weakness. It is active narrative positioning. The Pentagon is not only defending territory in the physical world, it is defending interpretive territory. It wants to remain the primary source of legitimacy, the primary filter of meaning, the primary institution that tells everyone else what the facts are allowed to mean. Most people stop at the content of the files. That is exactly the wrong place to stop. The real issue is institutional power. The files matter, but the machinery that releases them matters more. Because once the Pentagon demonstrates that it can reveal selectively, it also demonstrates that it can classify selectively. Once it proves that it can speak with authority, it also proves that every future silence will carry the same authority. That is the lasting effect of managed transparency. It does not reduce power, it refines it. And that is why this is part of a larger geopolitical contest over trust. Trust is not built by maximal openness. It is built by convincing the audience that the institution remains in command of the information environment. The Pentagon knows this. So do every other major state security apparatus watching the same battlefield. The question is never simply what was disclosed. The question is why disclosure was made useful, who gains by controlling the first narrative, and how the institution turns a moment of apparent openness into renewed leverage over the next round of secrets. That claim of authority matters because every disclosure also changes the media battlefield. Once the institution speaks, the next contest is over how the story gets amplified, distorted, or normalized. Once the institution speaks, the next question is not what is true. It is who gets to define what the truth now means. Let me be very clear about something. The Pentagon is not merely revealing documents, it is asserting that it remains the only actor competent to translate the unknown into public language. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something the mainstream conversation is completely missing. The media does not simply transmit an official release. It converts it into reality by deciding what kind of object the release is supposed to be. Is it a revelation, a joke, a debunking target, a viral mystery? That choice matters more than the documents themselves, because once the framing is set, the public is no longer reading evidence. The public is consuming a narrative product. That is the first layer of power here. The Pentagon releases information into a media ecosystem that is structurally rewarded for speed, novelty, and conflict. Outlets need clicks. Producers need segments. Hosts need something that can be turned into a 10-second clip. So the story becomes spectacle almost immediately. The question is no longer, what does this disclosure say about secrecy, institutional control, or the boundaries of classified knowledge? The question becomes, is this real? Is this fake? Is this bizarre? Is this funny? Is this viral? That transformation is not neutral. It is the mechanism. Spectacle diffuses scrutiny. Once the story is treated as entertainment, the audience stops asking who authored the disclosure, why it arrived at this moment, and what strategic problem it is designed to solve. The room fills with reaction instead of analysis. Laughter replaces investigation. Debunking becomes a substitute for political inquiry. Wonder becomes a substitute for institutional accountability. And that is exactly why this kind of release can benefit the Pentagon even when it appears, on the surface, to be a concession of transparency. A controlled disclosure is not surrender. It is management. It allows the institution to set the menu of permissible interpretation. It can say, in effect, we have given you the material, now argue about what it means while keeping the central advantage, only we know what was excluded, delayed, reclassified, or contextualized before release. The press rarely interrogates that structure because the incentives point elsewhere. Sensation travels faster than systems analysis. A headline about unidentified phenomena performs better than a sober discussion of bureaucratic timing, interagency bargaining, intelligence compartmentation, or the use of disclosure as signaling. So the deeper story gets buried beneath the surface effect. The public gets sensation instead of substance because sensation is easier to distribute and easier to monetize. The real story is not whether the files prove something extraordinary. The real story is why the release happened now, what pressure made disclosure useful, and how transparency can be turned into control. That is the part most commentary avoids. If an institution withholds everything, it is accused of secrecy. If it releases selected material, it is praised for openness. But selection is power, timing is power, framing is power. The institution does not lose control when it discloses. It often gains it. Most people stop here, and that is exactly why they miss what I am about to explain next. The Pentagon is operating inside a broader contest over trust, signaling, and the monopoly on interpretation. When it chooses to acknowledge the unknown without fully resolving it, it does not just manage domestic attention. It sends a message about who gets to define reality when certainty is unavailable. That matters because the media ecosystem amplifies the message in the most useful possible way. A mystery can be marketed. A secret can be serialized. A structural question is harder to package. So the public receives a performance of transparency while the underlying architecture of secrecy remains intact. The documents become content. The content becomes chatter. The chatter becomes the public record. And the public record is then cited as evidence that the matter has been aired, discussed, and effectively contained. But the deeper effect is not only domestic. Every narrative about unidentified phenomena also travels as a signal abroad where allies, rivals, and intelligence services read the move differently. When the media turns a strategic release into a week of spectacle, the institution gets the visibility it wants without surrendering the authority it needs. That is the real framework here.